Nestled between low ridges and heavy pines, the town of Henderson Hollow was the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades. One main street, a red brick courthouse, and a population that hovered just under 6,000. It was quiet, proud, and at a glance, ordinary. People here waved at each other from porch swings. Kids rode bikes to the corner store for popsicles. Church bells rang on Sundays. But the thing about perfect places is, they don't always tell the truth. I'm Daniel Harrow, and this is a Macabre record. The first thing visitors noticed about Henderson Hollow was how still it seemed. The houses were well kept, the sidewalks clean, the hedges always trimmed just so. Life moved slowly here, and no one seemed to mind. On paper, it was the kind of town people dreamed of retiring in, but if you lingered long enough, if you watched closely, you might have noticed something different, something that didn't quite fit. Like the way the kids from the north end of town never spoke to the ones from the south. The way one particular stretch of homes, 3 cul-de-sacs branching off Wainwright Drive, seemed too perfect. That's where the Carsons lived. To anyone on the outside, Mark and Eliza Carson had the ideal life. Mark ran the local bank. Eliza homeschooled their children and taught Sunday school at Calvary Fellowship. They had 4 kids, Emily, Ruth, Caleb, and the youngest, Matthew. Their home was a bright white colonial with black shutters and a wraparound porch. Their lawn was immaculate. Their mailbox had hand-painted flowers. People looked up to the Carsons. "I used to tell my husband, that's the family we should be," said Denise Harlow, a neighbor who lived 2 doors down. Their kids never screamed or made a mess. They dressed like little angels. It was like something out of a catalogue. The Carsons weren't the only family in that part of town who lived like this. There were the Dunlaps, the Hellers, the Meade family, all close, all sharing casseroles at one another's potlucks. Their children rarely came to the public school. Most were homeschooled. They all belonged to a group that called themselves the Covenant Fellowship Circle, which they claimed wasn't a church, just a support group for like-minded Christian families. But not everyone was convinced. Pastor Warren Collin of the First Baptist Church tried once, early on, to ask what the group believed. He was polite about it. He just wanted to understand. "Eliza told me," he recalled, "we believe in keeping the blood clean." I asked what she meant, and she smiled and said it was about spiritual purity, but something about it didn't sit right. Henderson Hollow was small, and people talked, but the Covenant families didn't. They kept to themselves. "They were polite, always," said Margaret Diaz, a retired school counselor. "But their children, their eyes, they never looked you in the eye. There were whispers. Stories passed from one backyard fence to another, that no one had ever seen the Carson kids at the park, that they never got sick, that they never went out unless it was in groups, that they wore long sleeves even in summer. But there was never anything concrete, nothing more than gossip. And in a town like this, where everyone just wants to get along, gossip never became action, until it did. Indiana, 1882, a time when faith and fear often walked side by side. In the small town of Marrowick, tucked deep in the flatlands and surrounded by cornfields, stood St. Apollonia's Hospital for the Incurables, a towering structure of red brick, narrow windows, and ivy-choked balconies. To most locals, it was simply the hospital, a place where the sick went to be treated or forgotten. But beneath its pristine halls, behind the surgery theaters and chapel rooms, there was something else, something locked, something hidden. I'm Daniel Harrow, and this is a Macabre record. When St. Apollonia's opened its doors in 1859, it was praised as a modern miracle. One of the first private hospitals in rural Indiana, founded by Dr. Silas Greaves, it promised advanced care, especially for those suffering from what the era called nervous ailments, melancholia, hysteria, fits. Greaves was an educated man, trained in London, and known for his interest in what he called liminal medicine, the space between science and spirit. The hospital, he said, was a place of healing, but not everyone who entered its doors ever came back out. And by the summer of 1882, a quiet panic had begun to grow. The story begins with a janitor named Elias Boone. Elias had worked at the hospital for nearly 9 years. He swept the halls, changed the linens, ran the boiler. He wasn't a man of words, but he paid attention. On the night of June 3rd, 1882, Elias was sent to fix a leaking pipe in the sub-basement, an area sealed off after renovations in 1875. According to the logbook he kept in a battered leather ledger, recovered much later, he wrote simply, 6-382, leak behind old surgical theatre, entered via coal chute, found sealed door, W-tar cross and brass plate, heard knocking 3 times, no one on other side. Elias never returned home that night. His body was found 2 days later in the furnace crawl space, his skull fractured, eyes missing, his keyring still clenched in one hand. At first, his death was ruled an accident, but rumors started to spread. And then someone found the list. A nurse named Catherine Bellamy, only 23 years old, had been cataloguing old patient records for the hospital's transition to state funding. In a sealed drawer in Dr. Greaves's former office, behind a false panel, she uncovered a thin, yellowing ledger titled, simply, Census of Internals, Not to be Discharged. It listed 37 names, all patients admitted between 1860 and 1881. None of them had official release forms, no death certificates, no transfers. Some were children, others were elderly. Most were listed as having spiritual corruption, persistent defilement, or, most often, threshold symptoms, confined. The last entry read, Patient 37, Annalise M. Poe, aged 14, persistent violations, door engagement, sealed per directive, June 1st, 1882. That name matched a girl who had gone missing 2 weeks earlier. Her parents had claimed she was at St. Apollonia's for treatment for fainting spells. They were told she had run off. Now Catherine knew something was terribly wrong, and she wasn't the only one. There's a strange kind of silence that follows when truth begins to rise, like dust shaken from an old rug, disturbed only by light and time. After the discovery of the census of internals, Nurse Catherine Bellamy went straight to her superior, Sister Margaret Lawton, the head nun overseeing St. Apollonia's administrative wing. According to later testimonies, Sister Margaret took the list from her, read it once in silence, and then quietly asked, "Did you show this to anyone else?" Catherine said no. Sister Margaret nodded, thanked her, and then locked the ledger in a cupboard. 2 nights later, that cupboard burned in a contained fire that blackened only one corner of the records room. Catherine was told it was a candle accident. She wasn't convinced. Neither was Dr. Oliver Braith, a young physician fresh from Johns Hopkins, who had arrived at the hospital only weeks before Elias Boone's death. He'd begun noticing irregularities long before Catherine's discovery, things that didn't add up. I was told patient 190, a boy named Tobias H., had died during electrotherapy, he later told investigators. But there was no body, no certificate. The logbook entry was crossed out. I asked where the remains had been sent. The matron told me he's beneath now, filed with the others. Braith assumed it was a euphemism for the hospital cemetery, but when he checked the burial records, there was no Tobias H. Then he heard about the door. The janitors had a term for it, the Macabre doorway. A heavy oak slab, reinforced with iron bands, located beneath the surgical theatre annex, sealed with a brass plate inscribed with a phrase in Latin, Finis intra, non aperire nisi purificatus. The end is within. Do not open unless purified. One janitor, Silas Carr, had seen it himself. Elias told me not to go down there, even before he died, Carr recalled in an interview years later. Said there was something wrong. Said they never came back up. I thought he was just drunk. Then Carr was ordered to dispose of some linens, soiled, bloodied sheets, from what he was told was an unusual surgical incident. He followed directions down into the sub-basement and saw the door for himself. It wasn't just a door, it was humming. I swear to God, it made the floor feel like it was breathing. By the summer of 1882, more staff had begun asking questions. Nurse Bellamy noticed that 3 other nurses had vanished from the payroll without explanation. All were listed in hospital logs as voluntary transfers, but no state facility had received them. One of them, Sarah Lindell, had left behind a journal. In it, she'd written, "They took patient 21 last night. He was crying, and so were the others. No one talks when they come for one. The orderlies in red take them down the stair. I heard singing and something like metal turning. The door opens. Then silence. Orderlies in red." Catherine began piecing together entries, some from medical ledgers, others from meal logs, even sewing orders. There was a pattern. Every third Thursday, additional rations were ordered. Sheets went missing. A team of orderlies not assigned to any known patients would sign the after-dark shifts. And always, those shifts coincided with patient numbers from the list. But the final crack came from the town itself. A boy named Gideon Poe, aged 12, claimed his sister Annalise, patient 37, was still at St. Apollonia's. He began sneaking to the hospital's back fence at night, whispering her name. One night he told his mother he heard her whisper back. She said, "Don't let them open the door again." His mother, Marion Poe, wrote a letter to the county medical board. It never received a response. Then she disappeared. The hospital said she had suffered a nervous collapse and had been admitted for treatment. No one ever saw her again, and still the door remained locked. But it wouldn't stay that way for long. Sometimes a truth grows so large it becomes impossible to ignore. In the fall of 1882, that truth began pushing its way to the surface of Henderson County like something rotten clawing up from the roots. It started with the grave markers. Dr. Oliver Braith, growing more suspicious by the week, took it upon himself to visit St. Apollonia's cemetery, an unkempt plot behind the North Annex, where dozens of wooden markers leaned at awkward angles under crabapple trees. He brought with him a copy of the hospital's internal death registry and began comparing names. There were more than a dozen discrepancies. Patients listed as deceased and interred had no markers. Others had mismatched dates. Some names didn't appear anywhere in the cemetery or in county burial logs. He found a cluster of 6 graves marked only with numbers: 17, 18, 21, 26, 30, 33. All numbers from Catherine Bellamy's forbidden list. That same week, a local gravedigger named Henry Wash confessed to a chilling arrangement. In a letter to the Marrowick Courier, anonymous but later confirmed by handwriting, he claimed, "For years I buried boxes from the hospital at night, pine coffins sealed, but never weighed right. Sometimes I swear I heard something move inside. I asked once. They said it was part of the treatment. That silence was mercy." Dr. Braith tried to take his findings to the county coroner, but the office was slow to respond. Whether it was fear, influence, or something deeper, no one knows. The investigation stalled, but the hospital did not. 3 days later, Nurse Bellamy was dismissed for breach of trust. Her records, notes, and journals were confiscated. She left town within a week and went to stay with an aunt in Evansville. The day after her departure, someone broke into the surgical annex. It was Gideon Poe. Now 13, the boy had been silently planning his entry for weeks. Armed with a small lantern, a Bible, and his sister's ribbon, he slipped past the south gate around midnight, crawled through the coal chute Elias Boone once used, and descended into the sub-basement. What happened next is pieced together from later interviews and Gideon's own written account, found scrawled in the margins of a Gideon's Psalms booklet weeks later, stuffed in the lining of his coat. It read, "The door breathes. It's cold, colder than the ground. There's a hum, like bees. I said her name. I heard my sister crying, and I heard someone else, many someone else's. The metal scraped, and I saw fingers come through the edge of the door, small fingers, a face, pale, bleeding from the eyes. Then they pulled her back, and it shut." Gideon made it back to town with torn clothes, shaking and incoherent. He was taken in by the local priest, Father Enoch Wells, who recorded his confession and alerted the county authorities. That forced the first real scrutiny on St. Apollonia's. The sheriff's office conducted a preliminary search, but hospital staff, led by interim director Thomas Hurst, denied all accusations. They claimed Gideon had suffered a fevered delusion brought on by grief. They insisted the door was part of an unused surgical storage wing, long sealed due to structural instability. No search warrant was granted. The town fell into something like a quiet panic. People began pulling loved ones from the hospital. The streets near St. Apollonia's emptied by dusk. The Courier ran a front-page headline, "Whispers beneath the floorboards." But the event that finally shattered the facade happened just before Christmas, December 19th, 1882. A patient, a middle-aged man named Ephraim Card, admitted 2 years earlier for hallucinatory seizures, escaped his restraints and made his way into the lobby during visiting hours. According to multiple witnesses, he was covered in bruises and had deep gouges around his mouth, as if he had been biting the inside of his own cheeks. He stood at the front desk, soaked in sweat, and shouted, "They're feeding it! Every new moon, 37 of us, sealed like mice in a jar. It wakes, it feeds, it watches." Orderlies tackled him to the ground. He died 2 hours later from trauma-induced cardiac failure. But the damage was done. The county board could no longer delay. A warrant was signed. Deputies were dispatched. On December 22nd, 1882, under grey skies and snowfall thick as ash, St. Apollonia's was formally placed under state investigation. The order, "Open the sealed door." There are places where the air itself seems to hold its breath, where even light hesitates to linger. The sub-basement of St. Apollonia's was one of those places. On the morning of December 22nd, 1882, Sheriff Abram Cray and 6 deputies arrived at the hospital with 2 county inspectors, a court scribe, and a Catholic priest. Among them was Dr. Oliver Braith, who had petitioned to accompany the search as a medical observer. His journal would later become one of the most chilling records of the events that unfolded. They descended into the sub-basement at 11:17 a.m. The stairwell was narrow, lit only by lanterns. Behind the surgery annex and past the disused coal chute, they reached the Macabre doorway, a heavy, iron-banded slab of wood, 7 feet high, stained with something dark near the bottom. The Latin inscription still gleamed on its brass plate, "Finis intra, non aperire nisi purificatus." The end is within. Do not open unless purified. The door was locked with a 3-bolt system and a rusted chain. Sheriff Cray forced it open with a crowbar. Inside, they found what the reports would describe only as an unregulated treatment and confinement chamber. But the truth was more grotesque than any euphemism. It was a large circular room, nearly 20 feet wide, with walls lined in stone. The floor was earthen, damp. At the center stood a well-like pit, about 6 feet across, with iron bars welded over it like a cage. Around the room were 7 wooden cots, shackled with leather restraints. The smell of rot, mildew, and blood was overwhelming. There were remains, bones in various states of decay, some partial skeletons, some nothing more than hands or ribs. Scraps of clothing were found, including a small blue ribbon later identified by Gideon Poe as belonging to his sister, Annalise. In a far corner, they found a stack of black-bound journals. Each one was marked with a Roman numeral. Inside were handwritten notes by Dr. Silas Greaves. Some dated back to 1861. The entries began clinically enough, descriptions of seizures, spiritual disturbances, and sensory hallucinations in patients. But as the years went on, the tone changed. Patient 5 exhibited contact with the threshold. He hears the voice. I must admit, I envy him. There is knowledge beneath pain. To reach it, they must descend willingly or be guided. The door is not a boundary. It is a mouth. It opens in hunger. According to Greaves's writings, the pit at the center of the chamber, he called it the Well of Quiet, was used in a series of treatments designed to expel corruption from the spirit by exposing it to divine silence. Patients were placed inside, restrained, sometimes for days. But it didn't stop there. The journals detail how certain patients, those deemed sympathetic to the voice, were never returned to the upper hospital. They were kept, watched, sacrificed. Annalise is the clearest channel yet. She spoke in languages I do not know. She sees without eyes. I believe she has passed through. The last journal entry, dated June 2nd, 1882, just one day before Elias Boone's death, read, "The door is ready. She is within it now. All that remains is to seal it in her name." The investigators also found surgical tools soaked in rust, small cages containing animal remains, and a stone altar smeared with what was determined to be human blood. At the bottom of the pit, investigators recovered a series of fingernail scratches etched into the stone, forming one repeated phrase, "Still here." A thorough inventory matched 26 of the 37 names from the census of internals. 11 patients remained unaccounted for. No bodies, no signs. The inspection report was filed on January 3rd, 1883. It concluded that Dr. Silas Greaves and select staff of St. Apollonia's had engaged in unauthorized confinement, ritualistic treatment, and criminal deprivation of life. Dr. Greaves, however, was never arrested because he had vanished. Records showed he resigned his post on June 4th, the day after Elias Boone's death. A train ticket was purchased under his name for Chicago, but no one ever saw him board. A man matching his description was seen near the lakefront 2 weeks later, muttering and barefoot. After that, nothing. What remained was silence and fear. The closure of St. Apollonia's was swift. The fear it left behind was not. Following the discovery in the sub-basement and the release of the investigative report in early 1883, Henderson County found itself at the center of a storm it never expected. State officials, members of the Indiana Medical Board, and federal investigators descended on the town, not because of what had happened, but because of how long it had gone unnoticed. It wasn't just one man, they realized. Dr. Silas Greaves had created something larger than himself, a system of silence upheld by blind obedience and religious fervor. He wasn't alone in the chamber. In the weeks that followed, authorities began questioning all current and former staff of the hospital. A pattern quickly emerged. A handful of doctors and nurses, mostly young, recently hired, had no idea what had been happening beneath them. But others had known. A total of 11 staff members were arrested. Among them were Thomas Hurst, interim director, who had overseen the destruction of records; Sister Margaret Lawton, who had suppressed Nurse Bellamy's discovery and ordered the torching of the ledger cupboard; Joseph Meade, a longtime orderly known by patients as Brother Joseph, implicated in the physical transport of patients to the sub-basement. Their trials began in June of 1883 in Indianapolis. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, former patients, grieving families. The defense for most of the accused was nearly identical. They claimed they believed the treatments were religiously sanctioned acts of healing. That Dr. Greaves had convinced them the patients were unclean vessels through whom a corrupting spiritual force could be isolated and purged. Some argued they had never seen direct harm. Others said they were afraid to speak. The prosecution countered with physical evidence: chains stained with blood, the journals, eyewitness testimony, the condition of the recovered remains. But it was Gideon Poe, now 14, who brought the room to silence. Testifying in a pressed coat too large for him, he looked straight at the jury and said, "My sister is still in there, not her body, her voice. They sealed the door, but I still hear her. When I close my eyes at night, I hear her whisper, 'Don't let them do it again.'" Gideon's testimony made national headlines. 7 of the 11 were found guilty. Sentences ranged from 15 years to life. Sister Margaret died of pneumonia in prison 3 years later. Hurst served 17 years before being released due to declining health. Of the original 37 names in the census of internals, only 4 bodies were returned to families. The rest were deemed unrecoverable or never found. In October of 1883, state authorities formally shut down St. Apollonia's. The building was abandoned. The sub-basement and the Macabre doorway were sealed with concrete. The state ordered all future psychiatric hospitals to submit to monthly inspections. But that wasn't the end. 2 months after the closure, a local boy exploring the overgrown hospital grounds disappeared. His name was Samuel Langridge, age 10. Search teams scoured the area for 3 days. His body was found near the edge of the hospital cemetery, face pale, eyes open, a blue ribbon clenched in his hand. There were no signs of trauma, no wounds. The official cause of death, respiratory failure due to exposure. Unofficially, Sheriff Cray, now retired, told a reporter off the record, "That boy wasn't just cold, he was empty, like he'd seen something so awful it just drained the life out of him." The town of Marowick petitioned the state to demolish the building, but due to legal disputes over property ownership and historical designation, it never happened. The Macabre doorway still exists, buried beneath 30 inches of concrete, and what lies behind it remains undisturbed for now. There's a moment after horror when a community decides what to remember and what to forget. In Marowick, Indiana, memory became a quiet war. In the years following the closure of St. Apollonia's, the town did what many do after trauma. It turned inward. The hospital grounds, though officially sealed, were left standing. Nature crept in. Ivy grew over the bricks, windows shattered and filled with crows. Locals came to call it simply the Hollow Place. The state erected a rusted iron fence around the property in 1885. A small plaque on the southern gate read, "Here stood St. Apollonia's Hospital, 1859-1883. May those who suffered here never be forgotten." But for decades, that was the only public acknowledgement. It would take more than a century for the victims to be honored. In 2007, a local historian named Melissa Grange began researching the case for her master's thesis at Indiana University. She uncovered the original patient census, Catherine Bellamy's confiscated journal, long thought destroyed, and the trial transcripts. Melissa published her findings in a book titled The Door Below, St. Apollonia and the Ethics of Silence. It reignited interest in the case nationwide. The following year, descendants of several victims, alongside the Indiana Historical Society, successfully lobbied for a memorial. On June 1, 2009, 127 years to the day, after the final entry in the patient ledger, the memorial to the lost of Apollonia was unveiled in Marowick. It stands just outside the old gate. A ring of 37 engraved stones circles a bronze sculpture of a door, left permanently ajar. Each stone bears only a first name and age. Gideon Poe's voice, recorded late in life in 1921, plays softly on loop inside a small listening station nearby. "We didn't speak because they told us not to. But the silence became a lie. My sister's name was Annalise. She was real, and she mattered." The trial of St. Apollonia would go on to influence state and federal mental health laws, most notably the 1885 Patient Transparency Act, which mandated independent oversight of private treatment institutions. In 1911, nurse Catherine Bellamy, who had moved to Chicago and gone on to help found 2 public clinics, was honored by the State Medical Society for her whistleblowing. Her journals were donated to the Library of Congress in 1965. Dr. Silas Greaves was never found. Over the decades, there were rumors, sightings in California, letters supposedly written in his hand, even a tale that he lived for a time in a monastery in France. But no conclusive evidence ever surfaced. Some believe he perished in Lake Michigan. Others believe he died in hiding. A few believe he was consumed by the very thing he served. Today, the hospital remains untouched, weather-beaten, silent. Urban explorers occasionally break the perimeter, some leaving with eerie stories. Others claim to hear the whispers of children behind the sealed walls. Whether you believe in spirits or not, the truth remains. 37 people vanished into that place, stripped of their names, their dignity, and in most cases, their lives. We remember them now because forgetting would mean it could happen again. We remember them because silence is no longer protection, it is complicity. We remember them because someone must, and because what hides behind a perfect smile can be the darkest secret of all. This has been a Macabre record. I'm Daniel Harrow.